Muted, Rudraksha, I can't hear you.
Rudraksha, আমি তোমায় unmute করতে বললাম. There should be a notification on your screen. Yeah, we're ready. So let me begin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's talk by Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is a path-breaking historian of global eminence and somewhat unusually holds a BSc degree in physics from Presidency College and a postgraduate diploma in management from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta.
It's a story of decline, yeah.
He completed his PhD in history from the Australian National University and is currently the Lawrence A. Kinton Distinguished Service Professor in History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He is the Faculty Director, University of Chicago Center in Delhi, a Faculty Fellow of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, an Associate of the Department of English, and by courtesy, a faculty member in the Law School. He is a founding member of the editorial collective of Subaltern Studies, a consulting editor of Critical Inquiry, a founding editor of Post-Colonial Studies, apart from holding numerous other positions. He is the recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Foundation Prize for his contributions to global history, was awarded an honorary D.Litt by the University of London, an honorary doctorate by the University of Antwerp, and was selected as an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I would actually have to go on forever if I attempted to read out even a fraction of his other accolades and achievements, for which let me come to some of the books that he has written. The Crises of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary Histories, with Ranajit Dasgupta, Some Aspects of Labor History of Bengal in the 19th Century, Two Views, Rethinking Working Class History, Bengal 1890 to 1940, Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference, The Calling of History, Sir Jodhanath Sarkar, His Empire of Truth, and many, many more for which I think I've run into the same problem again, just way too many to fit into an introduction. So without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Chakrabarty. We are indeed very, very fortunate to have him speak to us today. You know the rules. You will be muted for the duration of the talk. At the end of it, Professor Chakrabarty has said that he will take 4 or 5 questions when I shall ask you. Over to you, Professor Chakrabarty.
Thank you, Shorjesh Babu, and thank you everybody for being there, and particularly my friends, whom some of whose names I could read off, and some I may have missed. But thank you to the Bengal Club Library Committee for inviting me to talk to you. So there are 2 things I have to remember before launching onto my topic. One is, of course, today I'm told is Baishe Shravan. So Rabindranath is, of course, somebody who is always with us. Remember him, and I also want to give special thanks to Umadi, because it's really Umadi and Oshinda were wonderful, and she still is wonderful presences in our lives, particularly when I was a young academic, and they had a special gift which allowed them to communicate affection and respect at the same time to scholars much younger and much less accomplished than them. And I've always been a recipient of those things from both of them. And so when Umadi makes a request, it's very hard for me to say no to it. Otherwise, I had quite a lot of sense of trepidation about what I might say to this audience. I'm so used normally to speaking to academics alone that it's always difficult to think about how to come in from the cold, as it were, to speak to a very mixed audience, some of whom are academics and many of whom are not, or many of whom are academics but not in my discipline. So I'll speak for about half an hour, hopefully time myself. And then if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them for as long as the organizers want the session to go on. I hope I'm audible, right? There's no problem hearing me. Okay, good, excellent. So since I've got half an hour at my disposal, want to get to the chase, which is to say that there are two global processes, or we think of two global processes influencing our lives at the moment. One is a process we call globalization. And so if you think of the pandemic, one reason why the virus has spread so fast and throughout the world is because, as we say, we are globalized. We travel so much. If we've met through this on this electronic platform through Zoom, it's also because one way we are trying to reconstitute our lives is through all these global networks and connections. So there is this phenomenon that we have come to call globalization. We date it technically or academically from the 1990s, from 1991 in India's case, when Manmohan Singh was the prime minister and the economy was liberalized. The other process we think about is global warming. And what I want to suggest to you is that the word globe in the expression globalization has a meaning that's quite different from the meaning that the word globe has in the expression global warming. So I want to suggest to you that basically these two meanings of globe, one that is globe of globalization, the other is global warming, leave us with very different perspectives on human history. So globalization is a period that or is a process whereby the world literally became a globe. I mean, human beings, as you know, didn't always know that they lived on something that was global, spherical. The awareness that we live on a sphere is something that it really became realized in practice through the expansion of Europe, through the development of European empires, through the development of world economy, which you could loosely call global capitalism, and eventually through the processes that from in the late 20th century that we call globalization. And the most important thing when people look at it historically of the making of globalization was really the European nations' capacity to navigate the deep seas, the deep oceans. A German philosopher come jurist who was at one time was a Nazi supporter, Carl Schmitt, tells a very interesting story through the history of whaling, for instance. I mean, whaling was always a coastal enterprise until the Europeans actually developed ships that could navigate deep seas, and whaling became a deep sea enterprise. So this whole business of making the seas open up and become navigable was something that the Europeans contributed to human history. And it is through that history that eventually we came to be connected technologically, politically into this sphere that we call the globe. So you might say that the ultimate picture of globe, the globe of globalization, is a picture that you've all seen from 1972, which was a photo taken of the Earth from space by astronauts. And the picture is called the Blue Marble. All of you have seen it. It's one of the most seen pictures, which is where you see the only tiny, colorful dot in space. One of the things that the astronauts often said is that when they look out of their spaceship, the Earth is the only thing that has color. The rest is all black and white. And that's because Earth has life on it. It's really the existence of life that makes Earth colorful. So the word globe actually contains the idea of European empires, the idea of imperialism, colonies, anti-colonial battles, internationalism, all that is part of globalization. Now, global warming, on the other hand, the idea of global warming, the conception of it comes from a science that goes back to the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, scientists were working out that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere would warm up, except that some of the scientists who were discovering this, the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius, who was saying this in the 1890s, were thinking that this would be good for agriculture if the planet warmed up. But what the real science of global warming is something that comes together in the 1980s. So, and it goes, the more modern roots of it go back to the Cold War, the space war between Soviet Union and the US. And what happened was, after the Second World War ended, the atmosphere became, particularly through the years of the war and the years preceding it, the atmosphere became a subject of interest to scientists and to political leaders. So the President of the United States was actually advised every year by scientists on the state of the world's atmosphere. And there were several reasons for it. One was to find out about what the fallout from nuclear explosions was doing to the atmosphere. But more importantly, the atmosphere had also become a matter of military concern. Even during the Second World War, there was all these questions whether you could actually use the atmosphere to create floods or droughts in your enemy's territory. And then there was space war. And by the 50s, even some of the advisors to the US president were saying, particularly a man who headed up the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at San Diego, Roger Revelle, he was one of the first people to say that, look, humanity is carrying on a grand experiment by using up very quickly what it has taken the planet hundreds of millions of years to create, which was fossil fuel. That we were digging up fossil fuel and putting it all out in the atmosphere far too quickly than it has ever happened in the history of the planet. And that this was a grand experiment whose results were not known yet. This was 1956, 58. By 60s, in 60, a man called James Lovelock, a British scientist, who was very good at designing equipments, but also a chemist by training, I think, but really a sort of polymath, joined Carl Sagan's unit in NASA and stayed with him until 1966. And he was part of the group that was trying to understand, A, if Mars ever had life, B, if Mars could be made inhabitable. And so they were very interested in producing, designing equipments that would be able to detect signs of existing or previous life on Mars. And it's really the space scientists who kind of began to ask these questions as to why, Venus was so hot, Mars was so cold, and why the Earth seems to be so friendly to multicellular life and has been so for 500 million years, in spite of complex life having undergone 5 great extinctions. And it's this man Lovelock who then argued, through all kind of interesting steps in the argument, that life itself perhaps plays a role in maintaining conditions that are friendly to the existence of life. So that, as some of you would know, was called the Gaia the principle or the hypothesis, where he was arguing that life itself does something to maintain life. All this eventually transformed itself in 1985, when people from different disciplines, physics, chemistry, biology, all came together in NASA to form the first committee on what they call Earth System Science. And the insight of Earth System Science was that on this planet, geology and biology were connected. You could not separate the history of geology from the history of biology. In other words, life on this planet, that is our planet, Earth, the history of life has something deeply to do with the geological characteristics of this planet. Now, as they were developing this science, which is called Earth System Science, and the word system is there to indicate that not only do geology and biology come together to create conditions favorable to existence of life on this planet, but that this whole entity acts somewhat like a system. It has system-like qualities or systemic properties. And that, what it means is, see, from the late 30s onwards, with the rise of cybernetics, people were developing what we know as systems theory. So a lot of people were bringing these different sciences together to actually see if systems theory could be applied in understanding the nature of this planet and the different processes that actually take place on this planet. One man who headed up the Goddard Space Center in NASA was a man called James Hansen, who was also a space scientist, and he was actually a student of Venus. So if you think of these two characters, James Lovelock was studying Mars, and in studying Mars, he raised this question of life, and he said, life must play a role. So actually, he also said to his NASA colleagues, if Mars has to be made habitable, don't think of humans, just make it habitable for bacteria. That'll ensure that the planet will become habitable for humans one day. On the other hand, James Hansen, who was a student of Venus and actually used to study planetary warming on Venus, trying to understand why Venus was so hot, and realized that the atmosphere of Venus is made up mostly of carbon dioxide. He was aware of the fact that Roger Rebel had talked about in the 1950s, that humanity was putting out a lot of greenhouse gases. So he says, 3 months leave from studying Venus to study our planet, Earth, to see if Earth was also hotting up. And sure enough, he discovered that the Earth was hotting up, and they looked at all possible factors that could explain why the Earth was hotting up, eliminated them, and came to the conclusion that it was really because carbon dioxide, methane, and all these greenhouse gases were increasing in the atmosphere, and it had to do with what humans were doing. So James Hansen was the first person who told the US government about it, the US Congress. And that's when I think the older Mr. Bush quipped saying that I will deal with the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. But that was 1988. So you have to remember that before that, there had already been the problem of the hole in the ozone layer. And the United Nations had set up what's called Montreal Protocol for fixing the hole in the ozone layer. On that model, they set up what we know as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the IPCC was set up in 1988. And in 1992, you had the Rio Conference on the environment of the planet. And the reason why I mention all this is to say that two things, that global warming is also something we've been talking about roughly from the 1990s. That is from the 1980s. Globalization is also something we've been talking about roughly from the 1980s. And these two things came together at the Rio Conference, where basically the two very well-known activists who attended the conference from India, one of whom is still alive and very active, the other person has unfortunately died, and I'm talking about Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, who had just set up in Delhi the Center for Science and Environment, who were putting out extremely interesting annual reports on the state of India's environment in the 1980s, one of the first Indian organizations to actually give us a countrywide survey of what was happening to the environment. So they attended this conference, and they came out with a booklet, which was called Global Warming, a case of environmental colonialism. And their argument was, quite rightly, that the most developed countries were much more responsible for emitting these gases that were heating up the surface of the planet. And therefore, they should bear responsibility for it. And they had already hogged the carbon space that was needed for development, leaving little space there for developing countries. And that's why they proposed, and it was accepted, that carbon emissions should be calculated on a per capita basis. Because then you realize that actually the Americans per capita emit much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because they consume more, the government consumes more, all of those things. The whole question of why carbon dioxide is produced. So that was, so if you think of that, so that argument is really saying from the beginning of globalization, which has been an uneven and lopsided, unequal process. The Europeans expanded their empires by taking over other people's lands, controlling other people's lands. That helped them in industrialization. So their imperial expansion helped them to create this globe in which we were invited to participate, but as junior and dependent partners. And this explains why global warming has happened. So global warming has to do with either the bad conduct on the part of rich nations, or some people would say because of capitalism. And therefore, the argument that followed from Narayan's and Agarwal's position was that in trying to help global warming, in trying to fix global warming or the problems associated with it, the rich countries should make sacrifices. That they should perhaps not grow anymore, or they should give money and technology free to the poorer countries to help deal with this. Of course, from the time from 1992 to now, of course, the big changes are that actually purely in terms of total numbers, now, of course, China and India are also among the big emitters, and China particularly has overtaken the US. Not on per capita terms, but in terms of total emissions. So the story has changed somewhat, but overall, one could say, to bring the two arguments together, that it was not just the unevenness and the inequality of the global system that the Europeans created, in which we now all participate. It was also something to perhaps do with the scale of these developments, the scale of expansion. So now so basically what Earth system scientists getting together, some historians began to argue, was how much the world, not only did the world economy expand from in the last 200 years, we developed the capability, humans developed the capability to sustain more human beings. And so even the poor who might not have good life now lived for longer. And that in itself is a factor in the whole story. So maybe you can quickly look at the slides now, Mr. Mitro. Can I have the first slide, please?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, these people came up with the idea of great acceleration thesis. So they were arguing that actually, if you look at human history, world history, then you will find that everything, I mean, on the human side, has been increasing. And from the 1950s, they've increased at an exponential rate. So on all these graphs, the dotted vertical line is 1950. So whether you look at population, real GDP, urban population, primary energy use, water use, large dams, it's all going up from the 1950s in an exponential fashion. Remember that the human population was about 1 billion in 1900. By the end of the 20th century, so at the beginning of the 20th century, we were 1900. Middle of, end of the 20th century, we were 6 billion. Never have humans expanded on that scale. And now we are 7.5 going on to 9 or 10. And remember that in my lifetime, Indian population has grown more than 4 times. I mean, in my childhood, I grew up knowing that Tetrish Koti Mora, Nohiko Buhin. But of course, the word Tetrish doesn't apply anymore. Can we have the next slide, please? Mr. Mitra? Yeah, thank you. So this is kind of viewed by economic group. Actually, we can go on to the third slide, please. So if the orange slides were showing what human activities do, this is really in some ways showing how planetary processes are impacted on. So if you look at the rise in carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, which is also methane, the 3 greenhouse gases, surface temperature, so that's ozone depletion, you'll also find them going up in the same period, roughly from the 1980s on, growing up, in most cases exponentially. Okay, and and add to, on top of these, maybe you can take the slides off now, we can come back to them, Mr. Mitra. Thank you. So on top of that, there are other things you might remember is that, or I might mention if you don't know it, humans have become the biggest earth-moving agents on this planet. So we now collectively move more earth around than all the rivers of the world, do taken together. I mean, rivers are a huge earth moving, we are even more important than that. And if you look at certain things that we now create, things like, just to give you quick examples, concrete. I'll just give you the example of concrete. Now, concrete, even though early Romans used it, the global production of concrete after the World War II was about 1/3 of a billion tons a year. By 1970, we made 5 billion tons a year. Beginning of the millennium, that is, beginning of this millennium, we produced 10 billion tons of concrete per year, and now it's 30 billion. So altogether, we have already produced 500 billion tons of concrete. So for each square meter of the Earth's surface, there is a kilogram of concrete, and half of it from the beginning of this millennium. So it's really human expansion. But if you look at plastic, we produce enough plastic. So if you converted all the plastic we have produced into plastic wrap, we could wrap this planet around for more than 1.5 times. So it's this huge expansion of human economy, our impact on the human population. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Mr. Mitra?
Sure, sir.
Yeah, thank you. The one after. Okay, so that's why some Earth system scientists came together and they began to talk about planetary boundaries. This is I mean, just you get the idea. I mean, this has now been revised. This is from 2015. Some of these estimates have changed, but basically the red zones are the danger zones where we shouldn't go. But you can see that freshwater use is already dangerous. Land system. So the green area is where we should be. And they came up with this idea that, look, whatever social systems we have, whatever, that we must make sure that we don't affect planetary processes so much that our life is collectively imperiled. So they came up with this idea of planetary boundaries. And we're really looking for some kind of global contract between nations, that whatever they did, they would stay within these boundaries. And the next slide, please. So I have this slide. This is a child in my neighborhood, a colleague's child, actually. And the machine you see, the caterpillar machine, the earth-moving machine, this is now ubiquitous through the world. It's almost iconic of the human capacity to move Earth around. You will all remember in Calcutta, we grew up seeing small people, women often carrying soil and other things on baskets up bamboo scaffolding when the building was being built. But now this is a machine which has tremendously increased our capacity to move Earth around. And this machine has become so natural. We become so aligned in our own thinking with this increased human capacity that it's become extremely natural for this child to think that this is how the world is, that humans are huge earth-moving agencies, and it's our natural capacity. So maybe the next slide will make that point. The next slide, please. Yeah. So now you see the same child playing in a sand pit with the toy caterpillar machine. So in some ways, the child is growing up thinking that this is what humans do. Humans have these machines to move Earth around. And so these people are arguing that it's not simply the story of capitalism and empire. It's also the story of what this capitalism that has, on the one hand, produced us as a differentiated humanity, different between rich and poor, that same capitalism has also produced us as the most dominant species on the planet. With our technology, with the animals we keep. So now, actually, the most populous bird on the planet, if I asked you to guess, maybe you'd be able to guess it or not, is the broiler chicken. There are 21 billion broiler chicken on this planet. That's because we make them to eat them. The second most populous bird, the name I forget, is 1.5 billion. So this impact, so they're arguing that this impact of the expansion of our economic life and our economic and the institutional technological life is what is interfering with the planetary processes so much that our own existence is in peril. So I'll end by talking about the pandemic that we're going through now. So every account that you read of the pandemic, And I've been reading virologists since the pandemic broke out, because I was expecting a lot of, hellfires and brimstones and basically floods and droughts and fires from the climate change problems. This came from the left side. I mean, nobody was ready for it, even though now that I read virologists, I see that they knew that such a pandemic was extremely possible. So I'll finish my talk by talking about pandemics and pointing to what it actually leads us to think about. So if you take the years from the 1960s, infections coming to humans from animals have constituted 60% of the new infections have come from animals. Mr. Mitra, we can go off the slides again. Thank you very much. If you calculate the number from 1970s, then 75% of the new infections are zoonotic, that is, come from animals to humans. All of them in the last 20 years have come from wildlife. And the virologists are very clear that this has to do with the destruction of wildlife habitat. Why do we destroy wildlife habitat? Because we create farmlands, we create more new human habitations. I mean, you just have to look at some aspects of the expansion of Mumbai to see how leopards are trying to become urban animals and trying to eat dogs instead of the usual prey. We build roads through forests, and we mine. Plus we log timber, and there's illegal trade. All these things are basically creating a crisis in wildlife, but actually, which means it's creating a crisis of biodiversity. And that goes back to the Gaia point. So many scientists now argue that biodiversity should be thought about as just as non-renewable as petroleum, because petroleum is renewable, but you have to wait for 300 million years. So it's non-renewable on human timescale. Biodiversity, if it goes, takes millions of years to come back. But without biodiversity, we don't survive. So in a way, what has happened is that we have expanded the human presence on the planet to a degree in search of security, increasing our life chances, increasing the good life for us, to a degree that we've actually taken the planet for granted. And the sort of ways in which we used to think our desires are aligned with the planet, that nothing we do can bother the planet. The planet is either too big or it's meant for us. That expectation is getting disoriented by perspectives that are emerging, which are all actually talking about a very deep crisis in human life now, which is that we have planetary scale problems. We do not have planetary scale governance. So if you look at the pandemic, the problem with dealing with pandemics today, if you want to keep on with our economic system and keep on with growth, is that you will have to deal with pandemics fast. You'll need a global agreement that wherever a pandemic breaks out or the early signs of an outbreak seem visible, a global team should be able to move in and contain it. That requires a certain kind of politics of agreement, which is not available at the moment. If you remember, the whole fight between America and China about who is really about who controls who. The argument, the complaint about China is that China has not been always willing to share information. So this point is becoming visible in many places, that the United Nations was built up as an association of nation states to deal with problems that were global, not planetary. And in dealing with global problems, it was always assumed that there was indefinite amount of time at human disposal. So if I asked anybody, when will the Israelis and the Palestinians live in peace? Or will the Kashmiris ever live in an undivided land of theirs? People will say, look, we can't give you a date on it. We have to work on this. It may take 200 years, it may take 400 years. So the United Nations was created as a platform for bargaining, where people bargain for time. If you look at the IPCC and the global warming crisis, problems on planetary scale come to you with a planetary calendar. So they don't give you indefinite amount of time. So if you look at the IPCC scientists writing, they're always saying, there's a carbon budget, you only have so much carbon to burn. And if you do not, you can't go over it. And if you want climate change not to be dangerous, then you have to actually see to it that the carbon budget is actually followed. And that means certain deadline that you have to be done with this by this certain particular date. So all the scenarios are saying, if you don't do this by 2070, then this will be the problem. So there's always definite calendar. And if you look at what happens with IPCC, in the IPCC is that scientists come up with a figure, then governments bargain with that figure politically. So the threshold for dangerous climate change, according to scientists, was 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in the average temperature. The 2-degree rise that we hear about is a politically bargained figure. So the scientists came up with this, and then the governments bargained. Why? Because our thinking is basically still that we can carry on with our economic activities as much as we want. And this is like just nuisance some scientists are throwing in the way, and we have to sort of get around it by bargaining with it. Similarly, the third example I'll tell you, and then I'll finish, is the whole question of the Himalayan glaciers. I had a couple of maps, but you don't need to look at the maps to see what I'm saying. Rivers coming out of the Himalayan glaciers, fed by the Himalayan glaciers, actually, these rivers service about 7 countries, from Pakistan to Vietnam. There's no multilateral agreement between these nation states about how to manage the glaciers, how to look after their well-being. Because if the glaciers go, the rivers go, and we're all in trouble. Every nation treats rivers as their own properties. They either build dams to make people downstream suffer. There's no absolutely, but what we clearly need is a regional authority with teeth that will stand above the national authorities to manage the glaciers. So what I'm saying is that whether you look at the pandemic, whether you look at our glaciers, whether you look at climate change and the IPCC, you realize we are trying to deal with planetary problems. In other words, problems that involve planetary processes, which sometimes work on calendars that are much, much bigger than human calendars. As I said, fossil fuels are renewable if human beings could wait for 300 million years. The carbon crisis would be taken care of by the carbon cycle of the planet, but it might take 1 million years. But human beings, we live on our own lifetime and on our own sort of sense of time institutionally. And these time scales don't match. And the agency we have for dealing with that is the United Nations, which was created to deal with problems that are global or not planetary. And that's why I said that the expression globe in global warming means this planet, which has planetary processes that work on different time scales. While the expression globe in the expression globalization only refers to 500 years of human history, from European empires to the story of capitalism. And the story of capitalism, of course, is central to the story of expansion of human activities, but does not then give us insights into the kind of processes that the planetary processes that we interfere with, And to end with, so you've already had this talk by Pranay Lal on his book Indica, which is a wonderful book on the geological history of India, and it's very interesting to know that Gujarat was at some point only 3 islands, or that the Indus and the Brahmaputra are older than the Himalayas, and that the mountains actually grew around these rivers. These are fascinating stories he tells. It's a great book. But the question is, why should we read this? How does it matter beyond curiosity to know that this is what was happening? And there's an aphorism in Wittgenstein's book on a book called Uncertainty, where he actually says, when we look at a new building or an old building, we ask, how old is this building? Why don't we ask this question of a mountain? And the clear answer is that the building exists within human imaginations of time. There's a famous American joke of an American tourist being taken around by a hyper-nationalist Indian guy who points to a building and says, look at that building and see how old our civilization is. That building out there is 3,004 years old. And the American guy is surprised and says, I understand 3,000, but how do you get 4? I mean, how can it be so precise? And this man says, oh, that's because it's been 4 years since somebody told me the building was 3,000 years old. Right? So in the human sense of time, like, you would find hyper-Hindus saying, oh, the Vedas have existed for millions of years. I mean, they don't have any sense that human beings didn't exist for millions of years. So in a human sense of time, beyond a certain point, what does it matter? How old something is? But it matters when you think of the planet. But normally, the reason why we don't ask how old a mountain is because the mountain belongs to what for humans constitute the givenness of the planet. The planet is given. And scientists are saying, but we have damaged it so much that it's losing this quality of being just given. We cannot any longer take it for granted. And that is why if we keep on damaging it, it will damage us. And the pandemic is one example of how the history of biological life that existed well beyond the ken of capitalism or technology, has completely upended our lives by our interference, our kind of seeking that life out, because that virus probably has lived in the guts of bats for millions of years. Bats have existed for 50 million years. And now we are desperately trying to bring it within the ken of research, technology, market, money, profit, so that we can deal with it. So they're actually saying that if you keep on damaging the planet will lose this quality of being just given for us. Thank you. I'll end there. I've gone over my 30 minutes by about 10 minutes, but 12 minutes. But I'll be happy to take any questions that you had.
So please type your questions in the chat box and I'll read out some to Professor Chakrabarty to answer. The first one is already coming from Mr. Kakkar. The premise that rich countries are in a way guilty for global warming and our per capita emissions in India are low allows SUV driving urban consumers to ride piggyback on the poor and the rural population. Is that fair to the planet?
In my personal opinion, no, because this was actually pointed out by Oxfam in India a while ago, and of course was not a popular point within India. But you have to remember that Jairam Ramesh made some unpopular points in the parliament when he was the environment minister. He actually said, look, it's only because we failed to control population and we failed to solve the problem of poverty that you are making a virtue out of our two failures. I mean, our per capita emissions are low because bulk of Indians are poor. And bulk of Indians are poor means that we didn't succeed in moving them out of poverty while their numbers expanded. And so that Jairam Ramesh made that point out, which I thought was a very unpopular point to make, because sometimes Jairam Ramesh, his own negotiators on climate change, Chandrasekhar and people were opposed to Jairam Ramesh for that reason. So I agree with Mr. Kakkar.
Gentlemen, ladies, if you have any questions, please type in the chat box. Here's one from Anirban Purgas. So incongruence, to your 2016 Shomershen lecture titled Manobikata or Amanobikata.
Right.
Which prime factor do you think, Professor, is responsible for the Great Divide? Speed, greed, need?
The Great Acceleration is about speed. And the point is that the speed was made possible by the availability of cheap and plentiful energy. So look, I mean, humans have come this far, and until let's say if you go back to even when India became independent. So when we were about 3 billion, so we were at 1 billion at the beginning of the century. By the midpoint, we were about 3 billion, around 3 billion. To bring 3 billion people into a certain level of prosperity is a very different proposition from saying I will sustain 10 billion people at the same level of prosperity. Because that the demands you make on the planet as the number increases also go up. Need, greed, and speed. So I think technology made for speed. But look, I mean, there's a very interesting point that a geologist called Peter Haff, who teaches at Duke, makes. And he makes this point that human life today is so dependent on the connectivity of all kinds provided by technology. I mean, so for one area where medicine needs fossil fuel is for easier transport of medicine, apart from pharmaceuticals and things. So, and his argument is that if you today suddenly took away everything that connects us, everything from your iPhone to railways to planes, human population would crash, he says, to 11 million. And therefore, his argument is that technology has become the condition for biology in the human case. So sometimes when people say we should be a smaller population, I mean, the population will stabilize, but going back to a smaller scale population, which we need to, and we will probably go to, but poses all kinds of interesting problems of how to actually do that. So, so of need, I would say, probably in terms of proximate causes, the speed of our expansion, the speed of the technological growth has a lot to do. If I could quickly expand on it just for a minute and not to avoid other questions. So, this Israeli historian Harari, who has a very interesting book called Homo Sapiens. And he makes a fascinating point in his discussion where he says, if you look at the genus Homo, which is before Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens have existed for 300,000 years. But before that, you had proto-Homo. So there are basically 5 or 6 groups of Homos, man-like creatures that existed, out of which we became the most successful. We outcompeted all the other Homos. But when you look at stone tools that belong to the genus Homo, the main purpose of the stone tools, so I'm just going beyond 300,000 years, was to break bones. And everybody says, why breaking bone was so important? Because, he says, humans were so squarely in the middle of the food chain, now we're at the top of it, that they had to wait until larger creatures like foxes and lions had had their share of a kill, so that only the bones were left, and they would get and break the bones to get access to the marrows. From there to the fact that we are now the biggest predators on the planet has been possible thanks to technology and our capacity to work together. And this ascent to the top of the food chain has not happened on an evolutionary scale. So evolutionary change is very slow. So he says that, look, as lions became very good hunters, their prey, like the deer, learned to run faster. If human ascent to the top of the predatory chain had been on an evolutionary scale, then the fish would have had time to develop their strategies to avoid our trawlers. In a way, we grew so fast that the other forms of life around us didn't get a chance to adjust to the speed of our growth. And that is because the growth was dependent on technology. And human technology, there are many interesting, fascinating books on this topic. The difference between evolutionary growth and technological growth. Evolutionary growth is slow, and that's why evolution has the capacity to make many mistakes that don't matter. But with technology, like with a nuclear bomb, if you make a mistake, it matters a lot. And you can see that with fast growth of technology, we have now damaged the planet so much that it is mattering a lot. So I would say of the three, I would say anything that actually results in the speed, whether it's out of greed or need, is the most unwise part of the triumvirate.
Professor Chakrabarty, I'm going to read out 3 questions because it seems to me that they are sort of related questions. One is from Anindo Sinha. I think every individual on our planet has a certain worldview consisting of different ideals, ethics, moralities, and of course demands. How will we ever be able to set a common agenda that will unify our thinking towards a common goal? In this case, our protection of the earth and its natural resources. Secondly,
Sorry, I'll hear the three questions.
From Dhruv Khatar, we measure progress by GDP. Is this not totally ruinous? What happens to our economists? And from Chandana De, how do we achieve a planetary consensus or bring the climate change discussions to this level? So far, climate change agreements have not been taken seriously, especially because of the role MNCs. The MNCs are so ubiquitous and the close nexus of MNCs with political power. They're sort of asking the same question. How do we get out of here?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. Except I'll take the second question out a little bit and then go back to the first and the third. Now, first of all, you have to realize that economists have also realized quite a while ago that calculating GDP without looking at the environment is not a good idea. And actually, Prof Dasgupta has been at the forefront of that movement in economics. Traditional economics, even including that of the person I tremendously respect and like, Amartya Sen, still has a problem. I mean, Amartya wrote an essay in New Yorker a while ago talking about climate change, where he basically said, humans should care for other species because in a fiduciary capacity. In other words, out of the fact that they're weaker, we are stronger, we should care for them as a parent cares for a child. And the problem with that is that the bulk of life on this planet, by weight and numbers, is microbial. Is basically bacteria, fungi, viruses. These are the basic forms of life. And it's very hard to know what kind of fiduciary or custodial relationship I can have with the coronavirus in any form. But that only tells me that Amartya has thought more about economics than about biology. But so I don't think they've thought enough. But among the economists, I would say Partha Dasgupta did some serious work on this question. Going back to the first and third question. Now, I think the very important question. I don't have a simple solution, but there's two people I want to mention who have thoughts that are fascinating on this, though they're not optimistic thoughts. One is, again, the German jurist I mentioned, Carl Schmitt, who, in a very famous statement, actually said that humanity does not constitute a universe. In other words, we don't constitute a monoverse. We constitute a pluriverse. In other words, humans will always argue between themselves, among themselves, and disagree. And whatever solution we find, we'll have to come to it through disagreements. There's no other way out. Secondly, the great American evolutionary biologist, Edward Wilson, in a book called The Social Conquest of the World, where he basically, I mean, he's himself, of course, made his name studying ants, but he talks about all creatures that actually are social creatures. He calls them eusocial animals or creatures. And something he says is common to all society-making creatures is a tendency that he describes as a tendency to defend the nest. In other words, our primary training in becoming social is predicated on fighting our own kind that don't belong to our tribes. So he's arguing that some kind of tribalism, if you want to call it so, which he calls the tendency to defend the nest, is innate. It's kind of part of the evolved aspects of human beings. And therefore, so the mistake I think that Marxists still make and used to make is in thinking that somehow, if we got rid of capitalism, we will be able to create a society where some sort of agreed upon rationality would prevail for everyone. And clearly what we saw in the Soviet Union or in China is that it's possible for human beings to game such systems to their own ends because they disagree. There's conflict. So if you grant me the proposition that human sociality is predicated on human conflicts between humans, then it means that there's no simple solution of the world one day agreeing on a perfectly rational solution to this problem. A rational choice person might think that things are solvable only if there's a rational argument, but scientists find out to their despair that they might put the most rational argument, but there might be somebody like Trump not wanting to listen to it, or Hobbes, the English philosopher, put it very nicely once when he said, "I can bring my reason to you, but you have to bring your attention to it."
I'll read out two other questions
Sure.
of the same theme from KP Shengupto. Do you think that there will be another more serious pandemic that could halve the population and only then sense will dawn? And
Look, yeah. And
another one about this, has panic/trauma of human beings under such pandemic situation succumbed completely in front of global technology? If you can please explain.
what's the second question? Can you repeat the second question?
Yes, has panic/trauma of human beings under such pandemic situations succumbed completely in front of global technology? If you can please explain.
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding. Has panic succumbed, or have humans succumbed?
Have humans succumbed is, I think.
Okay. So have humans succumbed before technology?
Yes.
In their panic. Okay, so the question is, has technology now got an even bigger place in our lives than it should have because of the trauma and the panic we've suffered through the pandemic, right?
Yes.
That's the second question.
Yes.
And the first question was, if you don't mind going back, will there be another pandemic of this kind?
I mean, will there be another serious pandemic that would halve the population and only
okay. Well, I mean, halving the population, I can't say, but I recently wrote in Anandabajar. They asked me to write for a column, Ki Porchi. And I wrote about a book on pandemics that I was reading when the pandemic broke out, a book called Spillover, which is actually about how we are getting diseases from animals, from wild animals. And in that book, published in 2012, the man was saying, quoting medical people, that we were very lucky with the last with the last coronavirus attack that we had in the SARS infection, because the virus was such that you became symptomatic the moment you got infected. And they were saying, and this is more than 8 years ago, that the next big one will come when we get a virus where you're infected, but you don't become symptomatic. So that you don't even know that you're actually sick. And that's exactly what's happened. And all those books actually predict more and more pandemics if we still mine the forests, if we destroy wildlife habitat, if we don't care about biodiversity. Yes, there will be more pandemics. That's why scientists, medical people who are not socialists and who therefore don't call for the end to capitalism and who are quite prepared to work within capitalism, what they're asking for is some kind of global authority or a planetary authority that will deal with pandemics, overriding the power of national governments the moment there's an outbreak anywhere. So that's why I'm saying that, but we then get caught up between, politics between nations, which makes it very difficult for WHO or a United Nations agency to act with the kind of teeth that such a body might require. And that's why I was saying that, these are planetary problems. How many people die? We don't know. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but my own hunch as a layperson is that this current pandemic will go on for a few years, and it'll come in spikes and carry people out with it. So, I mean, given, look, I asked a doctor the other day, what happens if everybody wears a mask? He said, if everybody wore a mask, this virus will probably go. But again, you look at human beings. In Texas, they had parties where people were invited not to wear masks and not to keep social distance because they wanted to prove that the pandemic was a hoax. And some of them died. One of them apparently, just before he died, made a dying statement saying, I think I made a mistake. But, in Australia, a woman beat up police people because they were insisting on masks. So you have to deal with these kind of human disagreements. It goes back to the earlier question. So, and pandemics are not forever. The question is how many people will die and how much will suffer, how much the economy will suffer, how much poorer will become. Those are the questions, but it's interesting to see that when I read the Bible, they're basically saying we ourselves, by expanding our economies in this kind of mindless way, are making ourselves vulnerable. And then our solution is to throw more money at it, give billions of dollars to researchers. I mean, one person in Novartis, a US political person who had shares in Novartis, actually sold his shares recently and made a killing, knowing that the very fact that they're working on this vaccination. So this whole business of need or greed, whatever you want to call it. So our current logic is we'll keep expanding, pandemics will happen, we'll throw money at it, some people will die. This is a world of higher risks that we are creating for ourselves.
All right, this has to be the last question because we have already detained Professor Chakrabarty for more than an hour now. And this is a slightly different question. Fascinating talk. Your insights are quite novel. Marquez was way ahead of his time, and this is a kind of subliminal sutra that runs through 100 years of solitude. How greed for technology that came with the Americanization of Latin America led from rapture to rupture by thoughtless progress. Indian novelists like Gita Mehta in A River Sutra, and Arundhati Roy in The God of Small Things, and Amitav Ghosh in The Hungry Tide are also arguing exactly your point. How do you see post-colonial writers use the current pandemic to shape our thinking?
First of all, it's not just post-colonial writers, it's also non-colonial writers. I mean, there are American novelists who are writing about both global warming and the pandemic. There's a lot of science fiction people who have moved into this area. A lot of cinema people are becoming interested in creating. A lot of artists are creating movements that have to do with communicating these messages. It's a human problem, when with Amitav, yes, but I think one thing we learn from this, from Earth system science, other things, is that we can't afford simply to think of humans alone. We have to think of how to let other creatures, including these viruses, live in their own habitat. That's the most important thing. And Edward Wilson, the person I mentioned before, has a book called Half Earth, in which he makes an absurd sounding proposition where he says, we better leave half of the earth to other creatures. But when you actually read it, what he says, he has a more practical proposition. He says, look, there are 140,000 national parks of various kinds throughout the world in different nations. Now, all of these national parks they're called national parks. They've actually been influenced by humans because humans have put in new species there, invasive species, new plants. And they've often lost what is called the cornerstone species, the main species that held the ecology together. And he's saying that we should take the human influences out and get these parks to reacquire their pristine, pre-human quality. Now, one place that people often mention as a wonderful place of biodiversity is the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. But look, people ask me, what are the lessons of the pandemic? One lesson is very clear. The moment humans withdraw, the skies become clearer, the rivers become cleaner. In Kolkata and other places, you see birds. Some places you even see animals you haven't seen for ages. So it's clear that if humans withdraw, other creatures breathe a sigh of relief. And therefore, humans are the biggest spoilers of the planet and the environment. And I was showing the picture of this little child with the caterpillar, with the toys, to actually show how much we have naturalized this expansive human presence. So that child is growing up with the idea that the human capacity to move Earth around is eternal. Because every child thinks that the world I've come into is how the world always was, right? Until they grow up and read books and find out that no, there have been other people before and the world was different. There's a lot to learn, not just among post-colonial questions, there's a lot to learn from indigenous peoples. Because, most of the axial religions, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, most of these axial religions give you the sense that humans are special. In school, we were all taught that hymn, sort of, Shinvantu Visve Amitasya Putra. And there's a very interesting debate about who are the Amitasya Putra. Are they actually children of God? The Divyani, where the gods live, the abode where the gods live. Or are they humans? And some people argue that no, it actually referred to the children of gods. We humans, in our hubris, have decided it means humans. Whereas if you go to indigenous religions, indigenous people knew how to live as one animal among other animals and other creatures, which is why they have totemism. They could imagine themselves as half turtle and half human. We can't scale up their system, but there's a lot to learn from there. And Amitav Ghosh's case, for instance, he basically, when he writes about Sundarbans, he's learning from the people in the Sundarbans. And that's what is going to getting back to us. And I think there's a lot to learn in terms of scaling down, in terms of living other ways. But these are still in the realm of utopian thinking at the moment.
Thank you for that absolutely brilliant and illuminating talk. May I call upon Professor Choitali Mutro to deliver the vote of thanks, please.
Good evening, everybody. Joined by the chairperson, the co-chairperson, and the members of the Bengal Club Library Subcommittee, it is my privilege to thank Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty profusely for this evening's illuminating talk, in which he addressed the crisis, or the discourse, shall I say, of ecological crisis, in which he came out to us not only as a legendary historian, but if we think of the last two slides, also as a philosopher. Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for your time and also for answering the questions with so much care. Thanks to the participants and also the people who have been involved in coordinating this platform.
Thank you, and sorry.
It's okay, fine.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to thank you all again, and thank also my very good friends. Some of whom I couldn't see before. Durba is there, Parthopal is there, and other friends from my Presidency College group have all been here. Thanks to Umadi for, in some ways, pursuing me on this question. As I said, she's somebody whom I can never say no to. Thank you, Sharajesh Babu, for the role you played, and Mr. Mitra for help with the slides, and to all of you for your interest in the talk. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll leave the meeting now. Thanks. Bye.